Hello, good afternoon here anyway. This is Mother Storm from St. James the Less, and this is week 2 of our Bible Marathon. I do these videos primarily for those people who've signed up but aren't able to make it any given day. We meet each week on Sunday morning, and we spend 30 minutes just quickly discussing the chapters that we read the prior week. This week's reading was Genesis 22 through 42. Our stories, it was a continuation of the patriarchal, or I should say, we discussed this, matriarchal. Women play a huge role in these stories. It was a continuation of the matriarchal narratives of the book of Genesis, mostly written by the Yahwist, the oldest writer. We finished Abraham's story and the binding of Isaac and his death. Next generation, Isaac and Rebekah. We read about their betrothal, their sons Jacob and Esau. Next generation, we read about Jacob and his 2 wives, Rachel and Leah. Before he married, he had stolen the birthright of his older brother Esau. That was a wonderful story. And then he flees. He gets married to Rachel and Leah, 2 sisters. He has a dream where he has a vision of heaven and a ladder or a ziggurat. He wrestles with God later on and is renamed Israel. And then there's this story in there at the end of Jacob's life, curiously, about the rape of Dinah, who is Leah's youngest daughter. We talked, as you can imagine, about that. We were mostly women this morning, so that's kind of the direction that the conversation went in. I'll come back to that. And then finally, we got to Joseph, his 11 brothers. This is the next generation. Joseph's dream, Joseph being sold by his brothers. We talked about the 12 tribes of Israel originating in this story and how the story is really taking on more and more of a shape that's going to lead us to Israel itself and ultimately to Judaism. So we started out with all women around the table at first, and someone wanted to know about why are these characters in the Bible just so horrible, and what are we doing reading this? One woman even said, I feel like I just don't even want to read this anymore. It's not appropriate to be reading. Well, we unpacked that a little bit and reached a different conclusion ultimately. But, it is, these are not meant to be exemplary characters, role models for us. They're meant to be people like us, flawed and human, who God still works with and works through. And they are people in the Bible who also change for the better, as we all hope to do. So we're seeing reality in the human story mirrored in these stories. And that, to me, makes them much more interesting than reading about one-dimensional saints. So we talked about that. We talked about how women play a significant role in these stories. Are they disadvantaged, or are they the agents of their own sort of lives and destinies? We discussed that. There's a theory that the writer of these stories, purely speculative, was a woman. And so we tried, as a sort of thought experiment, we tried to imagine if a woman wrote these, how would that affect how we read these stories and how we see the women in these stories? And so we kicked that around a little bit. We talked about the sacrifice of Isaac. The 2 main big stories in the whole reading, these 22 chapters of the sacrifice of Isaac, probably the most written about story in the entire Bible. And then we talked about Jacob wrestling with God and being renamed Israel, a huge turning point in Jacob's life and a huge turning point in the life of Israel and what it would then go on to become as a nation. The sacrifice of Isaac was a great example of how Christians and Jews do read these stories differently. We call it the sacrifice of Isaac, and Christian theology, as it developed over the centuries, would come to link this to the sacrifice of Jesus on the cross by God the Father. You don't have to share that theology, but that is strong in the Christian tradition, the linkage of these 2 events. Obviously, Jewish people aren't going to make that connection. Also, Christianity has tended to view from very early on, even in our New Testament, the book of Hebrews, the writer there, 2nd century, 1st century writer, called Abraham a role model for his willingness to sacrifice his only son. the Jewish tradition has myriad interpretations, and it's a lot more willing than Christianity, or has been, to sort of challenge what's going on here, question Abraham's integrity in agreeing to this plan, in thinking that this was God's voice that he heard. So we had an interesting discussion about that, and about just how differently some of these stories are interpreted. And we're going to continue looking at that as our Bible study progresses with key stories. We also talked about Jacob's wrestling with God and being renamed Israel, the one who struggles with God. And that was obviously a nice segue into talking about how the Jewish tradition has tended to be more challenging when interpreting these texts than maybe, and nuanced and comfortable with ambiguity than maybe Christians have historically. So Jacob wrestling with God happens right before he has a reunion with his brother Esau, from whom he had stolen the birthright. So he's afraid. He doesn't think Esau's going to be very happy. Understandably, this was decades after that event happened. And he has a kind of dark night of the soul there by the river Jabbok. Some being, God, an angel, it's not clear in the story, wrestles with Jacob and knocks his hip out of the socket. And this angel or God renames him at that point. And his life, it really is a transformative moment in Jacob's life, where some of this trickery and deception seems to be over, and he sort of turns the corner, I guess, in his life. And it's a huge, obviously, transition, not only in his life as a character, but also in the life of what would become Israel. So we talked additionally, and then I'm going to wrap up because this is already going, oh my gosh, almost 7 minutes. Okay. We talked about biblical narrative style, its rigorous economy, the sacrifice of Isaac, brilliant writing. I don't, when we're reading it in English, we don't fully appreciate that, but we do. It is very well told, even in translation. Rigorous economy, repetition, silence, laconic, puns, word plays, irony. These are all the characteristics of the Yahwist writer. We talked about all of the etiologies, ethnologies, and etymologies that come up in the reading and in Genesis. And I've written on the board examples of each of those, which you can maybe zoom in on. But we're at 7 minutes. Next week, we'll be getting into the book of Exodus, which I'm pretty excited about. So I hope, and the rape of Dinah, we talked about that. And maybe next week I can bring that up if I come back to this. Okay, I hope this helps. I'm no scholar, remember, I'm just a lifelong learner, and someone who loves these stories. Okay, be well, thanks for watching.